Okay, I'm going to pick up where we left off. We left off on the coverings around the brain. They're called meningeal layers, and we're in chapter 12. So, starting from the outermost layer, it's dura mater. So, it's dura in Latin means very tough. So, dura mater is the outermost layer. And then the next one down is referred to as the arachnoid mater. And you may probably take note by now, arachnoid me referring to some type of arachnoid spider. So the only way I try to rationalize that is if I look at the arachnoid mater, it is connected to the next layer down called the pia mater. And the connection does to me look like a spider web. So I'm going to go ahead on a hunch that that's how it's probably named since it looks like the web of an arachnoid. And then the third layer down, like I mentioned, is called pia mater. And all three of these layers are together referred to as the meningeal layers. And you'll notice in between the arachnoid and the pia mater that there is a space here where fluid not only circulates within the brain, but eventually gets out of the ventricles of the brain to circulate around it. This space is referred to as the subarachnoid space. And when the fluid's produced, it circulates around the brain as well as in the ventricles, but it has to go back into your bloodstream. So after it circulates around the brain, it's going to enter a sinus, which is a large thin wall vein, and therefore it's returned back into your circulation. So those are the meningeal layers. Let's go ahead and clear this out. Go to the next slide. So this is just a picture of the meningeal layers. You can see the dura mater, the very tough ones, this white covering around the brain. And then you could see alongside of it are the sinuses, which recycle the cerebral spinal fluid to return back into your bloodstream. And that fluid, it circulates around the brain, does give it a little bit of buoyancy, so it's not crushed under its own weight. Okay. So again, larger pictures here of the dura mater and the sinuses. Now, the function of the fluid, well, first of all, where's the fluid made? So within each of the ventricles in the brain, recollect there's three of them, you have some capillaries within each of them called a choroid plexus. So this choroid plexus forms the cerebral spinal fluid and it circulates within the brain. You can see the arrows indicating the direction of the flow of the fluid. And then in the, let's look like in the fourth ventricle, there's some openings here called median apertures, and then there's two on the side called lateral apertures that allow the fluid to circulate around the brain, providing it buoyancy, and then to be returned eventually into a sinus, and then it's returned back into your bloodstream. So the fluid itself, let's have a look at here. So here are the capillaries, and it's producing cerebral spinal fluid, and the fluid itself is going to provide oxygen, nutrients to the neurons deep within the brain. And then also there's a mechanism to pick up the waste products produced by the neurons deep within the brain. And if it's circulating around the brain, provides it buoyancy, again, so it's not crushed under its own weight. Another thing you'll probably notice here is you got some support cells that just don't, not only you're going to find lining the ventricles of the brain, but you're also going to find them lining these capillaries called ependymal cells. So these ependymal cells, they're going to have little hair-like projections. If you recollect, these are cilia, but we're not propelling mucus. We're propelling the cerebral spinal fluid, so that way it doesn't remain stagnant and gets to circulate within the ventricles in the brain, as you can see in this picture here. So you can see here the arrows again indicate the flow of the fluid within the ventricles, and then there's openings in the fourth ventricle to allow it to circulate around the brain, and then eventually it's going to be returned into a sinus, and then it's back in your bloodstream. All right, this little guy has some sort of obstruction where the fluid's not being put back into the bloodstream, and therefore it's just accumulating around the brain. But newborns, if you recollect, they have soft spots called fontanelles. So as the fluid accumulates, the skulls of the brain, the flat bones, are being expanded out. So they'll find the obstruction, bypass it, or fix it, and the individual should be fine. But this condition is referred to as hydrocephalus. Hydro referring to the water accumulation of the fluid, cephalus referring to the brain. Okay, let's look at the spinal cord. Let's look at a larger picture here. So on the spinal cord, it is part of the central nervous system. And then what comes off the spinal cord are nerves. Up high from the brainstem would have been your 12 pair of cranial nerves. But what we're focusing on here are the 31 pair of spinal nerves. So nerves exiting the cervical or neck region, well, they're called cervical nerves. Nerves leaving the thoracic region, well, they're named thoracic, and then the lower extremities are lumbar nerves. And down below would be sacral nerves as well. So let me clear my drawing so I can move the image. So down below, you also have thoracic, lumbar, and then sacral nerves. And nerves, again, are axons wrapped with connective tissue going out toward targets or receiving sensory from targets located in the periphery of the body. Periphery means further away from the brain, okay? So you have 31 pair of spinal nerves, and actually where the spinal cord ends is in an area right here. It's called conus medullaris. That's actually where the spinal cord ends. And therefore, what you're looking at here are the extensions of the lumbar sacral nerves. They'll extend within the vertebrae and then they exit out toward targets. The other nerves up high, they don't extend. They just immediately leave and go toward the target. So the extension of these nerves, they give it an appearance where they call it the cauda equina. And somehow that means in Latin, horsetail. So the extension of the nerves looks like a horsetail before they exit the vertebrae. Okay. An actual picture here of looks to be the cervical nerves exiting the cervical region. And the thing you want to take note here is that not only do you have meningeal coverings around the brain, you're also going to find meningeal coverings around your spinal cord. So the very tough one, remember, is referred to as dura mater. So you could see it labeled here, the dura mater. The next one line was called the arachnoid mater. And then physically touching the spinal cord in this case would be the pia mater, not labeled. And then here you're looking at the end of the spinal cord. And let me get the highlighter out. So the end of the spinal cord is the conus medullaris, and then the extensions of the lumbar sacral nerves that extend within the vertebrae before they exit. This extension of those nerves is referred to as the cauda equina. Okay, clear the drawings, go to the next one. This picture is showing us what's referred to as a lumbar tap. In a lumbar tap, they'll extract out some of the cerebral spinal fluid down low, and then they'll do an analysis of the fluid to look for any inflammation like meningitis, something causing, maybe an infection of the nervous system. So they do it down low to avoid puncturing the spinal cord, which actually ended up higher. So what you're looking at here are extensions of the lumbar sacral nerves, not the actual spinal cord. Two, because you have lumbar vertebrae here, it's a lot more room to work with. Therefore, you're less likely to have some sort of puncturing of the nerves. And that's why it's done down low. The other thing they may administer down low when mom's ready to give birth is a anesthesia. So that way she doesn't feel pain as she gives birth to the newborn. And they'll do it down below. And that's referred to as a epidural. So they don't necessarily have to puncture the dura mater for epidural. Okay. Next slide. And we're looking at the spinal cord, actual drawing. So you can see the meningeal coverings. The tough one, the outermost one, is dura mater. The next one in line is the arachnoid. And then physically touching the spinal cord would be the pia mater. And you're looking at gray matter and white matter. And just to recollect, what gives the gray appearance of the brain are cell bodies and neurons. What gives the appearance of the white matter are axons wrapped around with myelin. Myelin, remember, is that lipid substance to help action potentials to go faster, so it can communicate to targets far away within a short period of time. So the gray matter here kind of looks like a butterfly or H appearance. They're referred to as horns when they come to a fine point. So the ones in the front are referred to as ventral horns. The ones in the back here are referred to as dorsal horns. And then the ones where it comes to a fine point on the side are referred to as lateral horns. And what connects the gray matter in the middle is referred to as the gray commissure. And within the gray commissure, you have the little hole referred to as your, where is it listed here? Central canal, where you got cerebral spinal fluid circulating within it. Let me clean this up a little bit. And what you're going to notice here are that axons are going to leave the spinal cord through what's called the ventral root. And I'm trying to look for where it's labeled. So all this here is referred to as ventral root. And then sensory from targets in the periphery of the body are going to enter through the back of the spinal cord and through what's known as your dorsal root. Trying to see where it's labeled dorsal root. And well, here's the dorsal root. And let me clean this up again. So these two roots, the ventral, the one in the front, the dorsal, basically come together and they'll be forming one of your 31 pair of spinal nerves. So these nerves, they'll have axons that send information to the brain as far as sensory entering through the dorsal root. And these nerves will also have the axons for motor. Motor, recollect, is to communicate to targets. So motor is also found in this spinal nerve. So all nerves, including the cranial, the majority are mixed, which means they have the nerves within them, both sensory and motor. The only nerves that are purely sensory, where you only send information to the brain, are going to be cranial nerve numeral 1 and cranial nerve numeral 2, which we'll see later in some slides, okay, in the next chapter. Okay, so tracts, recollect tracts or axons in the central nervous system. So you'll have tracts either sending in motor, coming down from the brain to communicate to targets, or you'll have tracts sending information to the brain for sensory. And where it's white, those tracts are wrapped around with myelin. Okay. So this area where it's white are referred to as funiculi or funiculus for singular. So you got two in the back, so those are dorsal funiculi. Two in the front are going to be ventral funiculi. And then the two on the side are going to be the lateral funiculi. And areas where you see a bulge, this is going to indicate where you got more cell bodies. And because sensory is entering through the back, you got some cell bodies and neurons located in that bulgy area, and that's referred to as the dorsal root ganglion. Ganglion, if you can recollect, are a collection of cell bodies of neurons outside the brain or spinal cord. So yes, we are outside here of the brain and spinal cord. And now that I brought up areas where it bulges, I forgot to mention on the spinal cord itself, this area where it looks kind of bulgy out, called the cervical enlargement. Again, you have a cluster of cell bodies in the spinal cord, but it's not ganglion because it's in the spinal cord. It's referred to as nuclei or deep neurons. And then you also have another enlargement down below called the lumbar enlargement. Okay, this is just an anterior view, looking at it from, I have to say superior view, not anterior, a superior view of the spinal cord being cut across. So you can see the gray matter indicating nerve cell bodies. The white matter is where you have tracts wrapped around with myelin. And then the roots. The one in the front, the ventral root, has axons for motor to communicate to targets in the periphery of the body. And then the dorsal root is sending sensory through the back up to the brain, and so that you can sense what's going on in the periphery of the body. And then the cluster cell bodies of these sensory neurons is referred to as the dorsal root ganglion. Okay, we saw this picture already. So this kind of explains what the axons are, what are the targets, whether they're motor or sensory. And, let's have a look here. Let me get the pen out. So we said motor. I should draw it in red. Motors exiting through the ventral root, which means you're going to communicate to targets, right? So SM, if you recollect back in chapter, let's see, 11, where they broke down the divisions of the nervous system, SN stands for somatic motor. Somatic means these are the axons that communicate to skeletal muscle. VM is visceral motor. Those are axons communicating to targets you do not voluntarily control. So that would be what? Cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands. So the ventral root, again, are the axons to communicate to targets in the periphery of the body. And then in the back, you have sensory, so that you're sending information dealing with sensory from the body. Okay, so let's just start here with VS, visceral and sensory. You're receiving sensory from areas deep in the body you don't have conscious control of. Just to give an example, maybe some abdominal discomfort, the digestive organs, you'd be sending sensory. So something in the abdominal region, those smooth muscle, those glands you don't have control over, you'd be sending information to the brain, indicating some sensory from those areas. And then SS, you're sending sensory from skeletal muscles. So you have receptors inside your skeletal muscles indicating when they're being used or stretched. So that's the axons for those neurons sending information up to the brain. It's located in the dorsal horn. Most neurons in general, not specific, but generally, they're going to be named according to their origin and then their destination. Okay. The ones here in red are for motor. That means you're communicating to targets away from the brain. So you're from the brain going out to a target. And then the ones in blue are for sensory. You're receiving sensory from the periphery of the body, sending information up to the brain. So let's just pick one of these tracks. Let's see how it's named. Cortical spinal tract. So this one's motor. So motor, again, you're sending information from the brain going out toward the periphery to communicate to a target. So cortical spinal tract from the cortex to the brain down to the spinal cord, and then eventually out toward a skeletal muscle. Rubrospinal, this one's coming from red nucleus or nuclei, cell bodies and neurons, located in the brainstem to communicate to skeletal muscles involved in like maintaining body posture. All right, let's look at a couple sensory ones. Spinal cerebellar tract from the spinal cord going up to the cerebellum. So that's sending information dealing with sensory to the cerebellum. Spinal thalamic tract from the spinal cord going up toward your thalamus, which is a relay center. So again, this drawing is just illustrating in general, tracts are named according to their origin and their destination. So one more, fasciculus gracilis. If you can remember, your gracilis muscle is the inner lining of the leg on the lower extremities of your body. So you're sending the information dealing with sensory from those lower extremities of the body up to the brain. All right. So These are tracks. Remember, tracks are axons, and you're sending information. How can I say these tracks are located within the brain or spinal cord? Okay. So the ones we're looking at here look to be dealing with sensory. Now, when you send information dealing with sensory up to the brain, it's not just one neuron, it's actually three. Okay. It's like passing on a letter to someone. There's more than one person that's involved in the letter, sending the letter. So here's when you send sensory to the brain, you got more than one neuron sending the information on up to the brain. Then once in the brain, you can interpret what it is you're sensing. Okay. So let's just take one of these here. Fasciculus gracilis. Again, your gracilis muscles in the lower extremities of the bottom of the leg in the midline. So here you're sending information dealing with like sensory, touch, or pain from the lower extremities of the body. Actually, just touch. Okay, the pain ones are called spinal thalamic. So here you got the receptor to indicate, hey, I'm feeling something, and what activates the receptor is physical movement. So here you send information up through one neuron. You can see the cell bodies here of this first pathway are located in the dorsal root ganglion. Then it goes up, and we're going to follow it, and then it crosses over in the brainstem and actually in the medulla oblongata. So most tracks, no matter if it's going up or down from or to the brain, they're going to cross over. Okay, they decussate, we say. So here it crosses over and it communicates to the second neuron. So far, that's two. Okay, and if this is sensory, your third neuron is always in your relay center. Remember, the thalamus is the relay for sensory. So the thalamus gets the information and then it's going to relay it, send it, in other words, to the correct cortex to interpret what it is you're sensing. So there's three pathways, three neurons when you send information or sensory up to the brain. Okay, another neuron you have here named called spinal thalamic. Yeah, this one sends information dealing with pain. We don't like pain, but pain keeps you alive. So whatever's causing pain, hopefully you get away from. So let's have a look here. Here's something indicating your overstimulating receptor, temperature receptor. Now you're interpreting as painful. So information goes through one neuron. And then this one crossed over pretty low in the spinal cord instead of up high, like we had previously gone over. So this one does decussate, but near the area where the receptor was. And it goes up, up. So far, this is the second pathway, right? And then our third pathway, again, is always in the thalamus. It's going to relay the sensory to the appropriate cortex to interpret, in this case, what is causing you pain. Okay. The lateral spinal thalamic is going to send information dealing with pain from the upper extremities of the body. So here, upper extremities, like in the hand, you activate a receptor indicating pain. You have one pathway, it decussates, communicates to the second, decussates crossed over. And now we're going to the relay center again in the thalamus, which relays the information to interpret what it is causing you pain. What I forgot to mention over here for touch, you also have a track to indicate touch on the upper extremities of the body called fasciculus cuneatus. So here's a receptor, here's something's touching you. So here's the first pathway of the neuron. It's going up and it decussates a crossover to communicate to the second pathway up high in the brainstem. And then again, the third relay or pathway of the neurons, always in the thalamus, your relay center. And then it guides the information to interpret what is that you're feeling as far as touch. So those are some tracks. One was the two here on the left are for touch, the two on the right are for interpreting pain. These are the tracks. It's just the same ones we went over. It just takes it in different sections just to bring your attention. Always your relay center for sensory is the thalamus. Oh, let me go back to spinal cerebellar tract. So your cerebellum, your job of the cerebellum is involved in providing a map how to get from point A to point B smoothly. So the keywords in the book are smooth, coordinated skeletal muscle movements. And the cerebellum has to know at any point in time where you're at. So not only is your brain getting sensory of where you're at as you're moving, you also have to send sensory to the cerebellum. So here you got a receptor inside your skeletal muscles to indicate, when it's being used as you're moving. So some of that sensory, along with like vision, balance, goes to the cerebellum. So here you go into the dorsal root for sensory. It does communicate to the second pathway, but it doesn't necessarily go to the thalamus. It goes to the cerebellum. So that way the cerebellum knows where you are as you're moving as well. Again, I mentioned most tracts decussate. You'll notice that the spinal cerebellar tract that sends information to the cerebellum does not decussate. It didn't cross over to the other side. So there's an exception there where you have a tract that does not cross over. Okay. Now, these are the tracts that we use to communicate to skeletal muscle. So you're communicating from cell bodies and cortex in the brain located in the precentral gyrus, and those neurons that communicate to your skeletal muscles is referred to as the primary motor cortex. And recollect, skeletal muscle is the only thing that we can voluntarily control. So let's have a look at how many neurons are going out to the target. So let's start with the pink one. You're leaving the precentral gyrus, you're going down through the brainstem. Here it's going to, in pink, decussate down low in the spinal cord. So far it's just one track. And oh, look, you have a little one in between, so that's two. And then the third one is going out to the target. And notice you're exiting the ventral root. Remember, ventral roots have the axons for motor. And in this case, you're communicating to skeletal muscle. So this is called somatic motor. Okay. So this track, the one that we just did in pink, is you call them one of two ways. They're called cortical spinal tracts, which is the one we just did. And then I believe it was the one we just did. Another one's called the pyramidal tract. Why is it called pyramidal? Well, I'll show you in a little bit. So here you got some cell bodies and neurons, again, to communicate to skeletal muscle. In red, the tract goes down, going down. And look, we're in the medulla oblongata here. So this is part of the brainstem where it looks like pyramids here. So these tracts, some of the tracts that travel through there are known as pyramidal tracts. That's why they're called pyramidal tracts. So one in red, it does decussate, it'll cross over, but near the target, and therefore it's going now to a second neuron to communicate to the target, okay? So this one didn't happen to have 3 neurons, just 2. But for the majority of tracks, it will be 3 pathways, whether you're sending sensory up to the brain or down from the brain motor, okay? The rubrospinal tract on the right-hand side. So we're in the brainstem here. In the midbrain area of the brainstem, you have some cell bodies, nuclei here called red nucleus that communicate to skeletal muscles involved in maintaining your body posture. Okay. All right, these are just sections of what we just went over, just magnified in pieces. All right, so I think that's pretty much the end of this chapter. So let me stop sharing, and that's the end of chapter 12, and I'll continue on in our next video. Talk to you then.